What is up, guys? So today we are going to talk about progressive overload, which is a concept that really gets bastardized in the health and fitness world, and a lot of people really don't understand fundamentally what is going on with progressive overload and then how to actually implement that in their training. And this really does hold you back from really maximizing your return on investment in the gym. So let's get into it. What is progressive overload? Well, progressive overload is basically the gradual increase of the stress placed on your muscles or muscle group, right? So it's basically a stressor. That's what resistance training is. You're putting a stressor on the muscles, and progressive overload is basically an increase in that stress over time, right? So we're effectively doing more than we previously were able to do, or that we previously did at least, right? And this applies to the muscles themselves. It applies to the various tissues, like your connective tissues, and then it also applies to the system overall. So our whole body, not just the individual muscles themselves, right? Now, when we're talking about resistance training, we're generally talking about the stress that is placed on the muscles themselves, and also to an extent the nervous system, because it's the nervous system that is kind of integrating all of this, or all of these stimuli, I should say, and then giving us the end result, which is the adaptation that we want, right? So we are talking about the muscle, and we're talking at a muscular level, but we're also talking about the system overall. Now, there are a few different forms of stimulus that seem to be most effective in eliciting the goals or the adaptations that we want, right? And these seem to be, for muscle building at least, and to an extent strength building as well, although that's a little bit different, they seem to be muscular tension or mechanical tension on those muscles, or in those muscles, if you want to think of it like that, right? So we need mechanical tension, and we'll get into that, what that looks like in a second. We also potentially can benefit from metabolic stress on the muscle or in the muscle. And this is more so related to stuff like the pump. So if you ever do resistance training, you get a bit of a pump, you get a buildup of acidosis, which isn't lactic acid as is commonly thought. It's actually just a buildup of hydrogens. But either way, you get that burning sensation. We can consider that a metabolic stressor. Now, there's a few different ways that we can target that specific stressor or bias that specific stressor. However, it does seem to be that mechanical tension is the more favorable, or it is the more important thing that we should be focusing on when we're talking about resistance training, and especially with regard to progressive overload. Now, there is another thing that we could potentially argue does play a causative role in building muscle, and that is muscle damage, although this does seem to be secondary to both the previous ones discussed, and especially secondary to the mechanical tension, right? Because we can induce a lot of muscular damage and then not actually get the adaptations that we want, the muscle building. For example, I can hit myself with a hammer, I can hit my muscles with a hammer, induce a lot of muscular damage, but that doesn't mean that the muscles are going to build up bigger and stronger over time as a result of that muscular damage. However, that also doesn't mean that we completely ignore the muscular damage aspect. But if we're looking for the biggest return on investment, we are going to focus on that mechanical tension aspect of progressive overload, right? Now, how do we actually do this, or how do we actually, progressively overload? How do we actually put more stress on the muscles over time? Well, the first thing that we have to realize, and this is one of those things that really gets bastardized in the health and fitness world, is that you can't just borrow from the future, right? You are only able to work within your capacity, right? So a lot of people get this kind of backwards. They get progressive overload backwards. They think that they are going to do more today, and that's what's actually eliciting the adaptations in the future, right? And what I mean by that, or how it looks in practice, is people will basically say, oh, I need to touch new weights, or I need to progress more and more. And they think that it is the fact that they've touched new weights that then leads to the progressive overload. But it's actually a little bit pre to that. It's a little bit before that, because you have adapted to such a degree that you are now able to use heavier weights. And that means that you need heavier weights to be able to continue adapting, right? So you're not actually borrowing from the future and all of a sudden, oh, okay, I've lifted heavier weights today. That's going to allow me to lift those same weights again in the future. That does happen to an extent, but we're not borrowing from the future. We're actually only ever working within our capacity. And that does actually have some ramifications for our thought processes in different aspects, which we'll get into, right? So how do we actually do progressive overload when we're in the gym? Well, the tried and true method, the one that everyone really focuses on, is increasing the weight that you are using, right? So if you are always using the same weight for a given exercise, let's say you're doing 3 sets of 10 of a given exercise and you're always using 100 kilos, you're never really giving your body a stimulus to adapt. You're never really giving your body a stimulus to progress, right? Because you're always doing the same thing. Yeah, you're always working within your capacity, but you're never really pushing it beyond. You're never getting up to those higher percentages of your capacity. You're just always working at the same level. And as a result, you're giving your body no stimulus to say, okay, well, we need to adapt so that this stressor that is being imposed on us is easier in future, right? Now, there are other things that we can do to really focus on progressive overload, and these are the ones that kind of get ignored because everyone focuses on just adding more weight. I gotta add more weight every single workout I go in. I'm gonna try add more weight. I'm gonna keep pushing the weight. And this often leads to a deterioration in your technique, and it actually generally leads to worsening results, even though you're focusing, or at least you think you're focusing, on the thing that seems to be driving the adaptations, which is progressive overload, and you're focusing on the thing that seems to be most beneficial for that, which is increasing weights, right? So how do we, focus on other things to ensure that we can still keep that progressive overload going and not necessarily have to increase the weight every single session, which is realistically not going to happen, right? You can focus on increasing your technique or improving your technique, your tempo, the tempo at which you perform that exercise, and the control in which you exhibit doing that exercise, right? So if you're doing, this is again a very common thing, you're doing your 3 sets of 10 with that 100 kilos, let's say it's a squat, you're doing that squat and your technique is pretty all over the place. Each rep looks different. A lot of the tension is going to your lower back. It's not where you want it on the quads, for example. If we improve your technique and we potentially even strip off some of the weight and get you to perform that exercise in a way that actually targets your quads, so you're feeling your quads working in the exercise and you really feel, okay, they are the limiting factor, we've improved your technique, potentially even reduced the weight, but we might get better results as a result of that. And especially as we build up to the previous weights that you have used, we should see a really good return on investment. So we've got increased the weight so far. Then we can also increase our technique or improve our technique, our tempo, our control. We want to be in control of that movement throughout the movement. It's not just bouncing in and out. You see this again all the time in the bench press. People will get to the bottom, they'll bench out of the bottom, or they'll bounce out of the bottom, and it's not really a controlled movement. It's not really smooth. We want to be in control of that movement throughout, so we're not really just using stored elastic energy to move through space or move that weight through space. We want to use our actual muscles to do that work, right? But we can also do, and this is something that a lot of people do actually focus on, we can increase the volume we do at a given weight, right? So let's say, for example, you're doing chin-ups. Chin-ups are quite hard to improve by adding weight. A lot of people struggle with that, but maybe you're able to do an extra rep here and there, right? So we've increased the amount of volume you're doing, even though the weight has stayed the same, right? And we can also do this by virtue of increasing the number of sets that we do, right? So maybe you were doing 3 sets of 10, and then you're like, okay, I can't really add a few extra reps. I can't really add weight. Maybe you could do 4 sets of 10, right? Or potentially build it over time. You do your 3 sets of 10, and then you do an extra set of 5. And then the next week you're going for 6, 7, 8, and you build it up until you're doing 4 sets of 10, right? So we have progressed over time. We are putting a larger stimulus or a bigger stimulus on the body, and we're kind of forcing that adaptation to occur. Now, we're still obviously working within our capacity. Again, you can't borrow from the future, but it gives us something to work on, something that we can be progressing, right? We can also increase the overall volume that we do for a given muscle group, right? Because I'm talking about the whole body overall. If we have certain muscle groups that potentially aren't developing the way we want to, and we've tried focusing on increasing the weight, we've really worked on our technique, we've really tried to progress reps, sets, we're doing different things. Maybe you just need a little bit more volume overall for that muscle group. For example, some muscle groups, they might respond really, really well. You might get great adaptations to doing 10 sets for that muscle group across a week, right? Whereas other muscle groups, you do 10 sets and you don't really see any progression, right? Now, this might have to do with exercise selection, it might have to do with your technique, it might have to do with a variety of other things, but overall, we might need a little bit more volume for that muscle group to really get it to respond over time, right? So we might go from, rather than doing 10 sets for that muscle group per week, we might go, okay, we're gonna do 15. We'll see how we get on, do that for 3, 4, 5, 6 months, see how we get on, see if we're noticing any benefits to that, and if not, maybe we'll do another bump, right? Now, we do have to take the whole program into account. You're not just gonna go, oh, I'm gonna jump up to 20 sets, 25 sets for every single muscle group. Most people are not going to be able to recover from that, or at least most people don't need that much volume. Of course, if you have all the time in the world, all the recovery capacity in the world, you can probably get away with a lot more. But overall, one aspect or one thing that we can do to increase the increase the stress placed on a muscle is increase the amount of volume you are doing for that given muscle group, right? Then we can also increase the frequency. Now, this is a little bit kind of secondary to increasing volume, but it does play a role. For example, you might be doing 15 sets for your chest, right? But you're doing that all in one workout, right? Once per week, you're blasting your chest out of it, you're doing 15 sets, and you're thinking, I was doing 10 sets, I wasn't really getting the results that I wanted, I bumped it up to 15 sets, and I'm still not really getting the results that I wanted. You have to remember that you're basically giving your body one stimulus each week for that given muscle group. We could do something like 2 stimuli per week for that muscle group, right? So we could spread that out rather than doing 15 sets on Monday and then doing 15 sets again on the next Monday. We could do Monday, Thursday, and we do, say, let's just make it even 8 sets and 8 sets, right? So you're doing 16 sets. So we do that spread across 2 workouts per week, and all of a sudden you'll start seeing the progress and seeing the adaptation, seeing better progress arguably from that, because you're giving that stimulus across the week. This has the secondary effect of actually encouraging a higher output for the number of sets or for the given volume of work that you are doing. And what I mean by that is most people are going to find they get a very limited return on investment after about 8 sets in a given workout. They just really notice that their performance kind of drops off. They're not really getting more from it. They're a little bit more fatigued during the workout, and ultimately we would be better off just doing less sets for a given muscle group to a degree. There's still a bottom threshold, let's maybe call it 5 sets, 3, 4, 5 sets. You still need to do a certain threshold to actually push those adaptations, but we would be better off spreading it across 2 workouts when we're looking at the higher ends of those volumes, right? So if we're doing, again, 15 or 16 sets, do 2 workouts, increase your frequency, you'll get better results as a result of that, right? Now, what we can also do, and this is really leveraging off the more metabolic stress side of things, we can decrease the rest periods, right? So this is a method of progression that we could focus on. Now, the unfortunate thing about this is it does seem to reduce our overall performance because you're going into subsequent sets with more fatigue, right? So you're going into your next couple of sets more fatigued. You go in, you do that first set, you're like, okay, cool, I got 8 reps at whatever weight I was using. You decrease the amount of time in between sets. Let's say you're doing 45 seconds now, and in that second set, you're just not able to get those 8 reps anymore. You're only able to get 6. And in the next set, you're only able to get 3, right? So we're actually decreasing the amount of mechanical tension put on the muscles then as a result of decreasing the rest period, right? So it's one that we focus on a little bit less, and most times we're really having rest periods of 1 to 3 minutes depending on the size of the muscle and the overall stress put on the system. But it is something that we could leverage, especially for those people that are, time crunch. Now, what I generally do, if this is the case, I'll just superset exercises. Antagonistic exercises especially are good for this. So you might do a chest exercise with a back exercise, and this can be really beneficial for, improving the density of work that you get done in a given unit of time. Let's say you have a 40-minute workout, you can get a lot more done by supersetting antagonistic muscles or antagonistic muscle groups. So it is a viable option. It is one of those things that we should keep in mind. But again, most times we're going to focus on increasing the weights, increasing the reps, increasing the sets. They're kind of the things that we want to focus on first and foremost, right? Now, another thing that we can actually do to progressively overload is increase the range of motion. Now, this isn't always applicable, and it isn't always something that we actually want to do. It can actually lead to worsening results, but in certain cases, increasing the range of motion has some benefits. If you're doing an exercise and you're not actually going through your full active range of motion, if we increase that range of motion, technically we're doing more work. If you have to move a bench press and you have to move that only 5 inches, let's say, versus 10 inches, like obviously you're doing a lot more work by moving that bar 10 inches, right? So we are putting more stress on the system overall. But again, we do have to be wary of this, that we're not just pushing ourselves into ranges of motion that we do not have control over, that our muscles are not really able to fully contract in, that are not able to really put forth the most amount of force and effort, right? Now, there is a little bit of a thing here which we could potentially argue is a method of progression, but I often use it as more of a sign of progression or a kind of proxy measure that progression is happening, and that is having a decreased rating of perceived exertion for a given weight, right? So let's say, again, you're doing 3 sets of 10 at 100 kilos, and that's at an RPE. So you're feeling like, oh, this is, very hard as an RPE 8 or 9. So you're like, this is quite hard. We can maybe say it's a reps in reserve. We have 1 or 2 reps in reserve left. And you're going, okay, that 3 sets of 10 is giving me an RPE of, let's just call it 9, right? If over time you start noticing that that 3 sets of 10 is now an RPE 7, we could say, oh, well, we've actually, decreased our RPE, and that was the method of progression. But in reality, it's kind of just a marker or a sign that progression has occurred. So we do want to keep that in our overall, framework of thinking, but it's generally not something that I'm using as a method of progression in and of itself, right? Although some people do like to use that in certain circumstances, and it does have benefits, but overall it's probably not the easiest thing for most people to use in their training, right? So to really just summarize here, the most effective ways that you can elicit or push for progression and push that progressive overload, we want to improve our technique and control. That should really be first and foremost, right? Make sure you're doing the exercises in the best way possible. Make sure that you are in control throughout the movements, and then what we're going to probably try to do is increase the weight that you are using for those exercises, right? After that, we're probably going to try to increase the overall volume that you do, and either doing a few more reps with that given weight, or potentially doing a few more sets with a given weight, or just overall in general, right? Now, some exercises, they lend themselves better to increasing the reps or the sets. Certain exercises, they're just really hard to progress the amount of weight that you are using. This is especially true of more isolation style exercises. Like if you're doing bicep curls, for example, like it's very hard to just continually increase the weight, and maybe you would be better off doing something like increasing the number of reps you do at a given weight, or potentially even increasing the number of sets you do, again, even at a given weight, or just for that exercise in general, right? However, other exercises, they actually lend themselves a little bit better to really focusing on progressing the weight that you are using. And very often these are these more compound exercises that use a lot of muscle mass overall, right? Now, the important thing about that is we don't want to have this either or thinking in our mind. we want to potentially even run multiple progression systems or progression methods at once. A lot of people do this. They'll have either like a double or triple progression method in play where they're like, okay, I'm going to try to increase the weight. If I can't increase the weight, I'm going to try increase the reps. If I can't do that, I'm going to try do an extra set or two. We can have multiple progression systems in place, and this does become more important as you progress your training, because if you're a beginner, let's say you're in your first 1 to 5 years of training, you can get away with really just pushing progressive overload via just increasing the weight that you're using, right? So that's kind of how I think of it. Now, there's a few questions that come along with this, and that is, do we need to progress every single session? And the answer to that is no. It's the overall trend that matters. It's the overall trend over time that matters more than the individual session, right? Now, obviously, the individual session is what builds up the trend over time, right? But a lot of people try to go into the gym and they're like, all right, I'm going to increase the weight every single workout, and they're trying to increase it by 2.5 kilos on every single exercise, every single workout, unless you have micro plates or smaller loading plates than that. And as a result, some exercises you're able to do that. If you do your squats, your deadlifts, for example, maybe you are able to increase at that rate every single workout, right? But something like an overhead press, or let's say a lateral raise or a bicep curl, you're not going to be able to increase by 2.5 kilos every single workout, right? So we need to keep in mind, what are we actually aiming for? What's the goal in terms of how am I going to progress this given exercise? Because again, it does matter on an individual exercise basis as well as the overall progression method of the program. But ultimately, we don't need to progress every single workout. We want to aim for some sort of progression, but it's not necessary for every single workout, right? However, we do have to keep in mind that we do want to see progression occur over time, right? So if you're still using the same weights you were 3 months ago, 6 months ago, something in your training needs to change, right? And generally what I'll say to people, a lot of my clients, if they're stalling on an exercise for 3 to 6 weeks, some people say 2 weeks, but either way, 3 to 6 weeks, we're probably going to analyze that exercise a little bit more closely. Now, this could be solved by a few things. Perhaps you're working too close to failure on that exercise and your technique is, falling apart a little bit. And as a result, we can just, dial back the intensity of that in terms of your proximity to failure. And then you probably see some progression over time. Or you could be doing too much or too little for that muscle group or for that exercise itself, right? Ultimately though, we may need to just swap out that exercise. It may be something that you've just really milked for all that it's worth, and it's something we just need to change onto something else, something that's similar, that works to similar muscles or similar muscle groups or similar movement pattern, but it's slightly different than what we were doing. And then we need to, at least give ourselves 4 to 6 weeks to really get into the groove of that before we even consider switching again. And again, we'll keep going with that. We'll milk it for all it's worth, and then we'll swap onto something else, right? So the thing about that is, again, we don't want to switch out exercises too frequently, but switching out exercises is something that's probably going to have to occur at some stage in your training program, unless you are very specific with your training adaptations, like maybe you're training for a powerlifting competition, and in that case, we probably want to really stay in the groove of the technique of the lifts that you're going to be competing in, right? Now, again, I just want to reiterate that you cannot actually force progression. You have already adapted, and that's what allows you to lift the heavier weights, do more reps, do more sets. And then it is that adaptation that has occurred that allows you to work closer to your ultimate ability, which then is giving you that signal to, okay, we need to adapt a little bit more than where we were, and then the next session you'll be able to do potentially an extra rep, control the exercise a little bit better, etc. Right? And then a final thing, which is a bit of a bigger topic: do you need to go to failure to progress? And that answer for that is no. There is a difference between training, which is what we're trying to do when we try to elicit the adaptations that we want, and then testing, right? So with testing, we're just testing how strong we are on a given workout or a given day. And the two things, while they do obviously overlap, they're not exactly the same. The vast majority of your time should be spent training rather than the vast majority of your time spent testing. And that's unfortunately the opposite to what most people do. Most people go into the gym and they're like, I'm gonna, go to my absolute max today. I'm gonna lift to failure on absolutely everything. And that's not necessarily the best way to train if we're trying to, get the easiest results over time. And I say easier in terms of you're not going to be injured as often, you're not going to feel as fatigued as often, you're not going to be having achy joints, etc. So we do want to progress, but you don't need to go to failure, and you don't need to test your absolute strength on every single exercise, every single session. Anyway, guys, I hope that cleared up some of the confusion around progressive overload. If you enjoyed this, drop it a like, drop a comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. It really does help the channel overall.